I'm Nisha Pillay. This is The World. The worst terror attacks ever on the British capital have left London reeling. 4 apparently coordinated bombings, 3 on the Underground, 1 on a packed bus at the height of the morning rush hour have left at least 37 people dead and several hundred injured. The attacks bore all the hallmarks of an al-Qaeda operation aimed at disrupting British Prime Minister Tony Blair's big moment, the G8 summit in Scotland. It was the nightmare scenario that police chiefs have been warning about for years, but Londoners never quite believed until today. The attacks came without warning. The first explosion was detonated on board a train near Liverpool Street Station at 8:51, killing at least 7 people. Just 5 minutes later, a blast in a tunnel between King's Cross and Russell Square left more than 21 dead. At 9:17, a bomb on a train coming into Edgware Road Station blew a hole through a wall onto another train on an adjoining platform. 7 people are known to have died there.
We got a call early this morning and saying that my sister saying that, telling us basically what had happened and that she was hurt and that she's on the tube somewhere and that she's at Russell Square, but no one's really telling us anything at the moment, so we're just kind of waiting to see what happens. It's just the not knowing, the phones are down, it's just the not knowing, we just want to get through and know she's safe.
Then half an hour later, a bomb exploded on the top deck of a double-decker bus near Tavistock Square in the city's Bloomsbury district. 2 passengers are confirmed to have died. Police say they're looking into the possibility that a suicide bomber carried out that attack. A previously unknown group, the secret organization of Al-Qaeda Jihad in Europe, has claimed responsibility for the blasts on a website. It immediately brought to mind last year's coordinated train bombings in Madrid just before the Spanish elections. Those 2 were linked to Al-Qaeda. No elections here in Britain, but the timing was clearly intended to disrupt the start of the G8 summit in Scotland, itself the object of a massive security operation. British Prime Minister Tony Blair flew down to London right away on hearing of the bombing. He's vowed the British people will not be intimidated by them. But the scale and sophistication of the attacks do mean that there will certainly be questions about the country's ability to foresee and forestall similar events in future. I'm joined now here in the studio by Baria Alamuddin, foreign editor of Al Hayat newspaper. In central London by Colonel Mike Dewar, a security and defence analyst. Mike Grannett, a former advisor to the UK government in emergency planning, joins us from South East England. And in Washington, we have Clifford May from the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. Welcome to you all. Mike Dewar, if I may start with you. The British Foreign Secretary and several others are pointing the finger to Al-Qaeda, but it's an organisation that never claims responsibility. So how certain can we be that Al-Qaeda is behind this?
Well, of course, we can't be absolutely certain. If you remember, a lot of people got it wrong in Madrid. And insisted it was ETA, the Basque nationalist group, including myself, incidentally. I think I got it rather wrong then. So no, of course we can't be certain. I suppose another possibility is the real IRA or someone like that. But if you ask me what I'd put my money on, it's some umbrella organisation which works under the general heading of Al-Qaeda.
Mike Grannett, can I ask you the same question? Do you think Al-Qaeda is the main suspect?
Sorry, are you talking to me?
Yes, indeed.
I'm sorry, you faded away for a minute. It would seem to be something like that, yes. I mean, we have the hallmarks of no warning attacks. We have a coordinated attack. We have an attack at a particular moment in the political calendar. Those would seem to point in that direction.
And this website claim, Clifford May, from an organisation none of us have heard of, but apparently linked to Al-Qaeda, at least it has Al-Qaeda in its title. Is that credible? How seriously should we be taking it?
It's one piece of evidence along with the others that we have. The way this was carried out, the similarity to Madrid, the fact that IRA terrorists don't normally operate in this fashion, the fact that it coincides with the G8. I think we have to figure that it's radical Islamists probably affiliated in some way or other with Al-Qaeda, which is not the same organization that it was prior to 9/11/01. It's a different organization. It's a little like, I think, like a snake that's been chopped up, but the various parts of that snake aren't dead. They're still alive and functioning, not as well as they were as one big snake, but they still function.
Bari Alamuddin, Al-Qaeda, not the organization it was?
Yes, if you allow me first, I would like to pay condolences to all the families of those who have left us and lost their lives, and also my sympathies to those that are injured. Well, there is a thinking behind that, if it's Al-Qaeda or not. It's interesting to note that that website, there was a very small chat when they published that claim, and then it was closed all of a sudden. There are those who believe that it's actually not the main Al-Qaeda, not the Osama bin Laden branch of Al-Qaeda, rather it is a Zarqawi's branch of Al-Qaeda. Of course, it's all Al-Qaeda. It's because they believe that Osama bin Laden had been greatly weakened, and it is a Zarqawi who has great followers, not only in Iraq and across the Islamic world, but also in Europe, including the United Kingdom.
Mike, do you think that the authorities were caught unawares with all the focus on the G8 summit, as one would expect in Scotland?
I'm sure they weren't caught unawares. We've been aware of a possible attack on London now for some years. In fact, senior police officers have said it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So all intelligence has been pointing for a long time, and indeed various attacks have been thwarted. 3 or 4 at least that we know about, and maybe even more. And I think we all knew, those of us in the security business, that eventually an attack would succeed. You can't prevent all attacks. It's impossible to have intelligence that is that good, unfortunately. So yes, I think this was an inevitability, and I don't think our previous discussion of what branch of Al-Qaeda it is really matters at all, quite frankly. It was almost certainly some form of radical Islamist organization. I think the important point to consider is whether it was homegrown or not, whether it was imported, whether the operation came in from outside, or whether all of it or part of it are British Islamists. And I think that is the important issue, because that is a much more difficult threat if that is the case.
Mike Granite, what are you hearing about that? There are some suggestions that this might have been some kind of homegrown cell which simply wasn't on the radar screen of British intelligence.
I think lots of things are on the radar screen of British intelligence and security, including the possibility of homegrown attack. I also have been hearing that people are not prepared to leap into this and make a snap judgment. They need to examine what's happened, look at the pattern of events, look at the evidence that comes forward, and then come to a conclusion. These things are not sorted out immediately in an instant. They need careful analysis, they need careful reflection, and then I think we'll begin to hear what might have happened.
But there has been a lot of preparation over the past few years, and we were just hearing from Mike Deere about how high the threat levels have been, and how seriously it's been taken. They've had many years to prepare. To what extent do you think that the emergency services coped as they'd planned?
I think what we saw this afternoon was a demonstration of the fact that the emergency services and many others besides, like Transport for London and the local authorities, have indeed been doing a lot of planning since 9/11. I mean, almost the first thing that happened in the wake of 9/11 in London was the formation of what's become known as London Resilience, which is an organisation bringing together emergency services, government, utilities, transport providers to plan just for this sort of event. And amid the horror of this, I think it's notable that we saw a move into action, an operation that dealt with multiple sites where horror had taken place and dealt with it pretty efficiently.
Clifford May, looking at it from Washington, this message that's being sent out to the leaders in G8, no doubt there is some kind of message being sent out. How is it going to be viewed?
Well, I think we should understand that they're saying you may think you want to talk about poverty in Africa or global climate change, but we are going to humiliate you, and we are going to show you that our demands, our grievances, and our power is more important than anything else. They would have liked, I think, to hit in Scotland directly, but they don't much care. Hitting London is close enough for the kind of work they're in. I think it perhaps does send a message, maybe not intended, to the members of the G8 that this war against terrorism is a long way from being over, and we probably need a lot more cooperation among the major industrialized democracies in order to fight it effectively.
And we'll be taking a closer look at that a little later in the program, Clifford. Baria, at this point, can I just ask you, you've been talking to your people across the Arab world. What's been the reaction to today's attacks in London?
Utter condemnation, to be honest with you. I don't think anybody who has any sanity would not condemn such attacks. There's been a change in the view from the Arab world since 9/11, I think, and especially also from what's happening in Iraq, what Zarqawi is doing to all those innocent people. Many people view these terrorist attacks as pure violence and nothing to do with Islam or even the causes of Islam or the causes of the Arab world. Many people now believe that to solve the problems in the Arab world, including the Palestinian problem, you do not go and kill innocent people. They see it as actually losing support in the Western world, specifically in Europe. Let's not forget that most people in London and in England in general were against the war in Iraq. I think this is bringing sympathy to Tony Blair and to his government and indeed for the war in Iraq, not against it. It is bringing Blair and Bush together, unlike, I think, what the terrorists wish to have. So there is condemnation across the board in the Arab and Muslim world. And I must add something. I do not know of any religion that calls for the killing of the innocent around the world or anywhere, specifically in England. And let's not forget, Edgware Road station was targeted. We all know that Edgware Road is Little Arabia.
Absolutely, right in the heart of the Arab community here.
Yes.
Thank you to you all for now. We'll be returning to this discussion to look at some of the longer-term impact of today's attack, if we can cast our eyes that far ahead. But first, let's go to the G8 summit in Scotland, which Tony Blair left right away to coordinate the government's response to the London attacks. But the conference was determined to press ahead nevertheless, although inevitably the bombings cast a long shadow. Well, Zainab Badawi joins us from the conference in Gleneagles. Over to you, Zainab.
Thank you very much, Nisha. Yes, well, inevitably, the atmosphere here became subdued almost immediately. Word got out of those terrible attacks in London. As one person here put it to me, it was the powerful who were targeted and the innocent who paid with their lives. And, of course, throughout the day, delegates here have been really expressing their horror at what's gone on in London. We've had various G8 leaders making statements to that effect. About an hour or so ago, the Canadian Prime Minister, Paul Martin, gave a press statement expressing his condolences. A couple of hours earlier, the French President Jacques Chirac also gave his condolences to the British people. Walk around the grounds of Gleneagles and all flags of the G8 nations are being flown at half-mast, as well as the flag on top of the Gleneagles Hotel behind me. Well, of course, Tony Blair is due back sometime later tonight, perhaps during the dinner that's taking place very, very soon. In his absence, the meetings have been chaired by the British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw and his senior official, Sir Michael Jay. The BBC's Bridget Kendall has been talking to Jack Straw. First of all, she asked him to tell us a little bit more about the response of the G8 leaders.
Their mood was very sombre, but very determined. Each of the leaders around the table has faced terrorism of one kind or another in recent years, so they're not unfamiliar with the consequences. Of course, George Bush faced the most horrific terrorist outrage in history on the 11th of September, but others too, in Italy, in France, in Germany, in Japan, have faced the threat of terrorism and the reality of terrorism. So everybody there knows what it's like, knows its consequences, and knows the need to fight it very forcefully.
But has this put the issue of security and terrorism on the agenda here at this Gleneagles summit in the way that it wasn't before?
Not really, because it was on the agenda already. It was discussed in great detail at the Sea Island summit this time last year in the United States under George Bush's chairmanship. Sea Island set an agenda for action by all the major states of the world to upgrade our protection against terrorism. There's been report, and a lot has been done, let me say, and there was already drafted a strong statement on counter-terrorism. So yes, of course, this summit is going to be remembered in part as a summit which coincided with these terrorist outrages in London, but the determination to fight terrorism was there already.
Now, you're here, the Prime Minister's not here, he's been called back to London. To what extent has it deflected attention from what was meant to be the focus of this summit? And to what extent, then, can you say the terrorists have achieved their objective?
Well, if the objective of terrorism is to kill people, they've killed people, and they've injured many hundreds more. That is absolutely terrible. if the objective was to ensure that during today television screens around the world would be dominated by reports of people killed and injured and mayhem in London, well, that's happened. But terrorists, yes, they can fill the screens on a day, they can kill people. But what they cannot and will not succeed in doing is in their overall objectives, which is bluntly, I mean literally, to destroy the way of life of people in the civilized world, whatever their religion.
And the agenda that this summit was supposed to be remembered for, Africa, global warming, is it going to make it easier to crystallise agreement around what was supposed to be agreed here, or actually more difficult?
It certainly won't make it more difficult, and I think that we were moving towards agreement on all these key issues of Africa and climate change and many other issues as well. What it has emphasised, however, is that the disagreements which sometimes take place around the room, of course they do, between leaders and countries, are infinitesimal compared with what it is that unites all the world leaders who are here assembled in Gleneagles.
So do you think before the end of this summit that there will be communiques which will satisfy all those people who've thrown so much attention on the issue of poverty in Africa and climate change?
I can't speak for all the people who are concerned. What I profoundly believe is that the outcome of this summit will be a far better focus on Africa with more resources and also in respect of climate change than would ever have been the case had the Prime Minister Tony Blair not put it on the agenda and worked so hard for an international consensus.
Now, a G8 summit is always a high-profile event. This was perhaps even more high-profile than any in the past. So there must have been worries that something like this could happen.
Well, there are always worries that things like this can happen. When I was Home Secretary, I worried about bomb outrages every night. You worry about these things all the time, and you have to put in precautions. But life has to go on, and we put in precautions. We've done everything we can, but we were always aware, as we took precautions, increased the staff of the police, the security and intelligence agencies, upgraded our coverage of potential terrorist suspects, introduced new powers to deal with terrorism, that one day there could be a terrorist outrage.
What does it say about the threat of terrorism in Britain, though, that for all your precautions you couldn't stop it happening?
Well, what it says is you have to have the best precautions you can, and they can always be improved, but we've improved them very much in recent years. But what it also has to say is that there has to be a determination to fight this terrorism and to defeat it. I remember, many people watching this will remember Irish terrorism. I remember it because I was caught up in a terrorist bomb blast 32 years ago, so I've not forgotten it. I remember the day when London stopped with 4 very large IRA bombs going across London. And London, yes, was disrupted, but we didn't concede the terrorist demand, and life did go on, and it has to go on.
Fair. And Zainab, if you're still with us, Tony Blair is flying back to Gleneagles tonight, of course. But the summit, can it really regather its momentum? Where does it go from here?
Well, it was a difficult decision, apparently, for Tony Blair to take, what he should do once news of the attack came through. Should he go to London and not come back? Obviously, he needed to go because he wanted to find out what was going on, be briefed and all the rest of it. And he really didn't want the terrorists to have any kind of success in seeing the summit completely derailed. So he chose to go and spend most of the day there in Jack Straw, hold the fort, as it were, in his absence. But one has got to ask the question just how much of a hole it has left, really, here at the G8 summit. The first day of a 2-day summit, the host leader, Tony Blair, is not here, chairing some very vital sessions on climate change in Africa, 2 topics that Tony Blair has championed so personally. He's almost staked his political credibility. So these are 2 causes which he holds very dear, and there he is. He's not able to take part in the discussions today. But yes, they did carry on talking, the G8 leaders, also the EU Commission President, Jose Manuel Barroso, and what are called the +5 countries, China, Brazil, India, Mexico, that kind of thing. They were also involved in these talks.
And apart from the public condemnation, of course, of the attacks, in London by various leaders. Did you also detect some unhappiness, some disquiet about the way in which the agenda has been hijacked in this way?
Well, I mean, everybody here you talk to obviously expresses their horror, their outrage, their sympathy to what, you know, because of what's gone on to the British people. But I have spoken to some of the African delegates, and they have said that whilst that's the case, obviously, they are extremely disappointed that here was their moment at last. Tony Blair had championed their cause, had put Africa right at the top of the G8 summit. They were really hoping that people's minds would be focused on issues of aid, debt, trade. George Bush had made a couple of statements about wanting to see both the United States and Europe lift their subsidies on their agriculture. And so they felt that their moment really, in a sense, had somewhat been overshadowed. Of course, on Friday, around 7 African leaders, including the chairman of the African Union, are here to press their case to see just exactly what kind of unanimity they can get from the G8. So I would say that, yes, certainly, the people I've spoken to have expressed some kind of regret that to some extent, of course, it's not clear just yet, but to some extent, proceedings have been overshadowed.
Zainab, thanks so much for putting us in the picture from the G8 summit. Well, still with us to continue the discussion, Abaria Al-Mudin, Clifford May in Washington, Mike Dewar and Mike Granite. Let's talk about the wider implications of today's attacks. Clifford, if I may start with you, you were talking earlier about the need for better coordination, but do you think this is really going to change the way in which the so-called war on terror is conducted?
Sure. As you know, Anglo-American cooperation has been very good. It's been less good with France and with Germany in particular. I would hope that this would be an opportunity for Prime Minister Blair and President Bush to say to Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schroeder, we need to work together on this problem in a way we haven't. You talked about the motives behind this. I think another motive was to say to the British people, look, we want you out of this war. After all, there was another attack on transportation systems in Madrid not that long ago, and the result was that Spain decided it was going to see if it could withdraw from the fight and make itself less offensive to the terrorists. I have no doubt that the British will not take that path, but I'm not sure that there wasn't some doubt about that in the minds of the terrorists, that they could actually make Britain accede to their will and in that sense have a real victory over Britain.
Maria, can I get a response to you from that? Do you think that whoever's behind this was somehow trying to change British policy?
Yes, I'm sure they have. I'm sure they have. And I think they have made it clearly this day because they wanted to target the G8 summit as well. And I'm sorry that it is more or less, this is the summit for Africa, the poor people in Africa, that this has been also hijacked. I think they're trying to get across many messages. Also, they're trying to tell perhaps the British people that they need to exert the same pressure that's been exerted from the Spanish. I agree with my colleague before that this is not going to happen. I don't think the British government is going to act like the Spanish government has done and pull out its troop or even some of its troop out of Iraq or even change its policy about this. Nevertheless, I do hope that the G8 summit would draw attention to the problems in the area. I'm in no way saying that they should do what the terrorists want them to do, but solving problems in the area like the Palestinian problem, like sorting out Iraq, would help a lot in getting these terrorists sorted out in many ways.
Just want to bring Mike Dewar in. I can see you shaking your head and desperate to step in.
Well, I couldn't disagree with Barry more. It's nothing specifically to do with Iraq. It's a much wider terrorist agenda. It's outrage at, as they see it, the secular Western way of life. It's outrage. And of course, there was a terrorist campaign before Iraq. I mean, look at the original attack on the Twin Towers nearly 10 years ago. Look at September the 11th. Look at the attacks around Africa at US embassies. It is an attack against, as the Foreign Secretary said, attack against our Western civilization in particular. When I was Deputy Director some years ago of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, I commissioned a paper by Professor Sam Huntington in which he actually wrote about this some 10 years ago, that there was a coming jihad, if you like, against the West. And I think This is, of course, by a tiny minority. I'm not in any way suggesting that this is some Arab movement. Of course not. But there is a wider agenda than just Iraq. And if Iraq hadn't happened, other reasons would have been found to assault our way of life. That's why we have a really basic problem here, which is not going to go away. It's not going to go away if we take our troops out of Iraq. It's not going to go away because the Spanish took their troops out of Iraq. It's a more fundamental problem, and we have to realize that.
Want a final word from Mike Garrett. Do you agree this is something we're going to be living with for a long, long time?
I think we will be living with it for a long, long time, and I think it's essential that people understand that and that we don't let our way of life and the way we do things be disrupted by that. I think up to now we've seen the British people and people in London particularly be particularly resilient in the face of terrorism, and it hasn't happily up to now diminished their support for the fight against terrorism. It's strengthened it. People have shown a distinct bloody-minded determination to get to work in the face of this over many years of terrorism, and we should do nothing to stop that.
Mike Granite, Mike Dewar, Clifford May, Baria Al-Mudin, thank you so much for joining us for a very interesting discussion on a rather awful day. And let me just remind you, before I go, our main news this hour, that London has been hit by a series of coordinated bomb explosions, 4 in total, 3 on the London Underground and 1 on a bus near Tavistock Square. At least 37 people are known to have died. It's the deadliest terrorist attack aimed at the UK. British Prime Minister Tony Blair has said that Islamic militants are responsible. That's all from the programme for now. From me, Nisha Pillay. Bye-bye.